Welcome, Heidi. Thanks for being a part of the series.
Thank you for having me.
So, Heidi, here, you produced a film without any background in film or really any knowledge of the industry. And your film was called Stranded Nation.
Mm-hmm.
So, tell us a little bit about what your film is and what it's about.
So, a stranded nation is basically talking about our stranded assets in Canada. So, what money we're actually getting for our natural resources, how we're extracting them properly, and who are consumers and who is purchasing our resources. So, the film really tackles a varying amount of issues. There's quite a bit in this conversation, in this narrative. But I'd like to try to really focus on different aspects of it, which would be that Alberta is certainly under this global international anti-oil and gas campaign, the tar sands campaign. There's also a lot of issues around our NAFTA agreement, essentially with when we're talking about resource development cross-provincially, how we interchange our goods when we're developing them and extracting them from Alberta, and then we're shipping them to coastal issues and coastal pipelines. So there's a varying, like I said, a varying amount of topics in that, but it's essentially based around Canada's strength as a whole and what we represent.
Awesome. So, tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to end up making the film.
It's kind of a long story, I guess, but essentially what happened was I was working in social work in New Brunswick, and I was anti-oil and gas. And much of my social work background is obviously based on community development and talking about how we work together as a whole. But largely in part, I was definitely educated around the aspect that oil and gas was a negative thing. It was a terrible thing. It was obsolete, and it was eventually going to be phased out of Canada, and especially out of the economy. And that was something that really struck me during the film. That was really quite a strong narrative that is not correct. Now, having moved to Alberta, and I drove across Canada and just kind of ended up in Calgary, I began serving out here. And once you're serving all the time and you're starting to chat with people on a regular basis, you start to learn a lot more about their jobs, their work, and the community that's here. There's a wealth of knowledge about Canada and what we do in Alberta, but it's not well translated outside the province. So that's kind of where the desire to make the film came from.
So, at what point did you decide that you're going to make a film?
That was so weird. Essentially what happened when I got laid off from oil and gas, I was working in surface land, and I was sitting down on the couch and I was watching Leonardo DiCaprio's film. And I thought to myself, I remember watching it the first time a long time ago, and I was like, wow, this is such a good documentary. It's so informative. And I remember rewatching it and thinking, oh my gosh, there's so much misinformation about Alberta, about Canada, about oil and gas, about where it's headed. And I just remember thinking, why doesn't the industry make anything? So then I started doing more of the background work about maybe there's a filmmaker out there that already had and just hadn't published it properly, or it wasn't well known. And there really wasn't anything. I mean, I found a couple of anti-oil and gas documentaries, but nothing that was based specifically on Canada and in the narrative of us selling our oil and gas at a discount to the United States. And that's a very, very strong story, and it's not well known outside of, like I said, resource developing provinces or areas. So then it just organically started from like serving a table one night and kind of chit-chatting about what are like the trending themes and frustrations in oil and gas. What are the issues that they're most concerned about? And there's a lot of like kind of overlapping in there, a lot of rants, a lot of people kind of saying misinformation, some correct information. And that's kind of where the background of the research started, is just really just talking to people in the community, because that's the best way to learn, is by asking people that work in it every day and they're dealing with the regulations and all the issues that are coming down from federal government and outside of that as well.
So what did the pre-production phase look like? You managed to find, I guess, a videographer to help you produce the film, and you did it with, it sounded like less than a skeleton crew.
Yeah, it was beyond less of a skeleton crew for sure. When I first started, like you said, I didn't know anything about film. I didn't know anything about what 4K was, what 2K was. I didn't know how to edit. I can barely operate my iPhone, let alone try to like make a documentary. But there was a couple of things that were really useful. YouTube was a really good, useful tool for me. Just kind of learning the beginner languaging around film and how editing works, how lighting works, how all these things are, kind of part of the production. And then I started putting the feelers out, and I had two guys that originally started with the interviews. And then I realized it wasn't quite what I was looking for. Plus, I didn't know how to speak to them very well, so it was getting really expensive, and I couldn't just bring them out for a day, and I wasn't really directing them properly. And luckily, I came across Arden Shibley, and he's a really talented guy in the film industry. And I actually just hired him initially for droning. But then when I got droning with him, I was like, wow, you're so great, and your quality is there, you're affordable, I trust you. And then I convinced him to do the interviews. And then after the interviews, I convinced him to do B-roll, and then I convinced him to do the editing. So within that, there was obviously a lot of mistakes, and I reached out to other people, and it just wasn't quite jiving the way I wanted it to. And it wasn't quite the vision that what I was expecting to see. And with Arden, like I said, I just got really, really lucky with him because he had just the well-rounded package overall, and was super opinionated about the oil and gas industry. Wasn't an advocate or a pro fan. Wouldn't what I would say as like your typical person working in oil and gas, which provided a lot of depth, I think, to the documentary itself, because we combated a lot about topical issues, about like what was going in the film, what was factual, all these type of things. But with that, it gave it a really organic feel, I think, to the overall production of it.
So how did you go about scripting it or storyboarding it, and how did you decide who to interview?
The interviews were very separate from the scripting. It sounds ironic, again, it kind of, because being so new and so rookie in this space, I kind of flipped everything upside down. So things I probably should have started with first, which would be like moods, what is your thesis, all this other stuff. I had no idea. Like, I was just asking questions and trying to get people that I thought would be really cool to get on film. So my first interviews with BMO, they were great. They provided a lot of information about the economy, which I didn't know. And that kind of led me into further questions when I would go to the next interviewee. I was really lucky when I got Frank McKenna, though, because he is such a legend back east. Like, he's one of the most respected politicians on both liberal, conservative, doesn't matter. People have a really, really admirable way of speaking about him. And it was kind of interesting because I cold emailed him, and I just said, like, hi, Mr. McKenna, I'm a new filmmaker from New Brunswick. Would you be interested in being interviewed? And gave him the list of questions. And I didn't hear back from him for a couple of weeks. And I thought, oh, well, he's like bred and done, like no big deal. But he was actually in Europe. He didn't get his emails. So he messaged me back almost like 3 weeks later. And he's like, I'd absolutely love to be part of this. Love supporting New Brunswickers and understanding the oil and gas industry. So he was really pro-advocate about the educational aspect of oil and gas. And from there, because he's such a reputable name, it got a little bit easier, after I had those first 3 interviews in my belt, because then I'd cold email Michelle Rempel's office and say, like, hey, I have Mr. McKenna. I also have BMO Capital Markets that I've previously interviewed. Here are the questions. Feel free to look at the editing after it's post-edited, pre-edited, whatever you're more comfortable with. I will go through that process, and I kept it very, very open, so that they had all the tools and all the understanding. So I wasn't just blindsiding them in an edited documentary version that they weren't comfortable with. So yeah, and I guess every interview was a little bit different. Chris Zablisky was the last interviewee I added to the film, and to be honest, he's probably one of my favorites. He just is exactly what I was looking for that portion of the film, and I couldn't quite find it. And this guy came into Joey's, where I was working, the restaurant, late night, and he had a whole bunch of clients, and he was talking to me. He was like, well, what do you do for work? And I was like, oh, I'm actually a documentarian now. Like, I'm making this documentary. And we went for coffee the next day, and he goes, you need to get this guy, Chris. And he sent me the YouTube video, and I was like, perfect. So he gave me his contact, and then everything was kind of water under the bridge after that. Chris agreed to be on the film. And large in part was very surprised when he heard Frank McKenna was on the film as well. That was kind of like, oh, okay, you're a little bit more professional. You have a name behind you that's quite well respected in oil and gas and elsewhere. So,
wow, that's really cool.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting.
So how long did the whole process take from when you first started filming to when you finally released it?
It took about 2 years from when I started, type thing. So, I mean, I really could have pushed that 2-year mark quite a bit shorter. But my self-doubt when I started, it took me about 6 months to even talk about it to anyone because I was so nervous, and I was just afraid to, if I put out this terrible production, and it was just going to be embarrassing for my name type thing. So, and it was actually funny when I went home, I told my grandparents about it, and they were like, "You're doing what?" They're like, "You're making a movie?" And I was like, well, it's kind of not really a movie. It's just like an informed movie. And started talking about it. And again, once I had gotten Frank McKenna, that really changed. It was a game changer for me. I just really felt invested to represent him properly and to really showcase what he was saying on camera. And it was such a fascinating interview to sit in through, even what you don't see on camera, what I saw off camera, and all the stuff that was edited out. There's just so much passion, so much love for the industry, so much love for people in Canada, and I learned a lot from that, and it really kind of brought the heart of the film of what I wanted to come across in. So,
what did you do in terms of research prior to the interviews to develop your line of questioning?
The line of questioning was a little bit I had most of them kind of already written down. I asked a little bit, I varied a little bit, but I tried to keep it as consistent as possible because kept them very open-ended. Just what is the proper way to develop resources, or how is Canada leveraging its resources properly? Those were kind of the general open-ended questions. And they gave such great answers usually, and they're quite long answers, that I didn't really need to ask too many specific, can you explain this more? What does this mean? That kind of just came naturally, I think, with the conversation itself. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I was so new about filming. I was like, well, I don't want to vary the questions too much because then you're going to get into the rabbit hole of oil and gas, which is such a, like I said, a vast conversation. It's really difficult to break everything down and say, okay, well, what's relevant, what's Canadian, what's international, how do you talk about oil prices without going too far detailed into anything, right? There's just a lot of conversation around it, and I try to keep it basically as if my grandma was watching it, and this is what I always ask in the editing: would my grandma understand it? Is my grandma going to understand this? If I go down into this explanation, is she going to get this explanation? So that was kind of if the answer was no, then it didn't get put in the film.
So did your perspective throughout kind of the year and a half you were really working on it change about the industry quite a bit? Did it kind of reveal a lot of things that you weren't aware of prior?
Oh, for sure. I think the biggest thing that when I first struggled with is that I still was holding on to a lot of my old biases that I hadn't thought I knew about the industry. So even though I was wanting to provide something for our community and to get people on camera, I didn't think how much it would actually change my perspective as a whole and foundationally how I thought about it. Because you think about fracking or you think about extraction of a resource, it is invasive to the environment. And that was a question on my mind, was how invasive is it? Why do we need it? And do we need it? And all of these questions were kind of going through my mind. And it's well, yeah, I'm pro-economy, but how can I be pro-economy and also be an environmentalist? Or I don't even like to say environmental, a conservationist. How can I be both? How can I love the earth and still give back and still have a consumerism habit? And I think that's really where the balance of that conversation needs to come from, is that it's not all or nothing. It's about all of that kind of complementing each other. And when I started to get into carbon sequestration, or I got into venting and flaring regulations or technology development, well, how much of this is actually fluff. And then you get into it and you realize how incredibly passionate these people are about developing these new technologies. And it is world class. And, you hear this so often that it almost drowns out the meaning of it. But it is world class, and it is something that you look at other countries, and they're Norway, Russia. You've got, United States coming up here. Lots of people are asking questions about where we're headed in terms of these technological developments. And that's something that just, obviously, because it's so boring, and it's very engineering, and it's very, non-passionate. It's just a fact. It is just something that doesn't make mainstream media very often because of the overall, approach of it is just not something that an average person is going to be like, oh, this is something I want to dig deeper into, which is too bad, because I really think that's where the industry is the strongest at. And I think that's where the leadership really shines through the most, is through that area.
So what have you discovered in the last couple of years in terms of the government's approach to oil and gas, and what, in your opinion, they're doing wrong or right or should be changed, especially from a federal level?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So federally, I think there's a couple of really interesting aspects about CO2 emissions, we'll just call it emissions in general, is that they are very, very specific in what they're expecting in by 2020 and by 2040 and by 2050. And without really putting any kind of onus into entrepreneurs and to technology and to how that is going to make everything more efficient. So LNG is a really good example. We talk about LNG and it's like, well, what is it? And the fact is that if we switch all of Asia to LNG, that lowers global CO2 emissions. So how do you have that in a policy framework where you say you're anti-LNG or anti-oil and gas? And that's really, I don't know if it's an educational thing or if it's just a PR thing, whatever it is, it doesn't always jive with the feds. And I think that's really hurting Canada, and I think that's not looking at it in the proper sense of like what natural resource development is. And it's not just oil and gas. And this is the biggest conversation that I like to bring up back east and back home in New Brunswick, is like we had so many natural developments happen, by forestry, by fishing. And because of the lack of conservation that was happening around and the lack of regulatory process, we've had some really sketchy things happen. We've had some really bad things happen to the environment. And that's where conservationists work with industry. They don't work against industry. They come up with plans. They come up with specific guidelines, specific regulations. And that's what provincially in Alberta we do very well. And whether you agree with it or not, and again, it doesn't come down to this, it comes down to sensationalization around the topic, is that it's so not as polarized when you're working in it every day than what you see with maybe a group of activists not agreeing with it publicly. And that's just what gets perpetuated every single day, right? But there's tons of people that work with oil and gas industry, parks and wildlife. You've got, conservationists that work in rivers and fishing and animal population. All these things are integrated into how we look at the environment and how we look at developing any kind of industry, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was shooting for Imperial Oil up at Cold Lake for a little while, and I had no idea the levels they went to for protecting the environment there, and replanting all the trees everywhere, and just all the systems and processes they have in place to avoid things happening. And it's really extensive. And the things that they do too to work alongside like the Indigenous people there and make sure they have rights that aren't infringed. And I didn't have any idea it was to that level. And I think the majority of people wouldn't have a clue, especially if they're people out east and so far removed from the industry. And I've never been there or been close to it. Like if you look at factory farming, like especially cattle and stuff like that, it's a way bigger area of land impacted. You have all kinds of things going into water streams that shouldn't. But you go up to like Cold Lake and it's just beautiful forests around the oil stuff.
That's right. Well, I think that's, again, it's not that the film talks about this as well. It's not the lack of scrutiny that's the problem. It's that it's all this or all that. That is the problem. It's that you are not allowed to do anything else in resource development, whether that's expansion of a forestry project, whether that is oil and gas, whatever it is. But yeah, we still demand consumerism aspects of our lives, whether that's Uber Eats, whether that's the plastics, whether that's shopping, whether that's buying our food at Safeway instead of the local grocery store that is a local farmed owned kind of operation. These are all things that are part of the global conversation that people need to start having. And it's so much easier, and Chris talks about this in the film, it's so much easier to point a finger and say, that person should do that, this person should do that, when it comes down to sitting down with ourselves and saying, how do I be a conservationist? How do I be an activist for my community and for proper resource development? What can I improve? It doesn't come like that. And I think that's really where the federal government is really missing the overall message, because like you said, the agricultural sector, they pretty much, it's not probably always going to be the case, but they're not in the media every single day. You're talking about like this over and over and over again. Like, you've got tons of industries that are not doing their part to protect the environment or to do their due diligence in their communities, whether that's with First Nations accountability and making sure that there's a certain percentage of First Nations from those communities that are getting hired. That's all stuff the oil and gas industry is doing now, and they're being incredibly proactive. And I think we should be really proud of that. And I think that's something that has kind of indirectly, from producing the film, made me an advocate for it, because I just was shocked by the amount of influence and care that they're putting into everything.
So what do you think about the impact of production and then bringing in oil from places like Saudi Arabia versus Canada?
Yeah, and Saudi is a really interesting conversation. So New Brunswick, they import quite a bit from Saudi Arabia, and we also have other parts, which is Venezuela and Iraq, and it's not just Saudi Arabia, right? And I think, again, I was sitting down in a conference and I was talking about this in Halifax, and I was like, yeah, sure, you don't want to start fracking in Nova Scotia, but at the end of the day, you're still using natural gas. Would you not want it in your backyard that's localized, and that you're providing jobs or providing stability? You have accountability, you have governance, you have all of these huge regulations to pay people more, whatever it may be. And I said, it's just such a sad thing to see. And they'll say no, and then just continue to consume and continue to import. And I think that's really where my strong side of Canada is coming out a lot more. It's like, we need to start being better exporters and not importers. We are a very blessed country. We're so blessed with this beautiful provinces and like how vast they are, how like huge our country is. That it's not just, like I said, oil and gas, and we got to really focus on this water resource development. It is all these things that we need as humans to live and to do what we do every day. And having that accountability and holding all industries accountable is really where we should be looking at, and it shouldn't just be this one-sided argument.
So where do you see oil going now? Do you think, I don't see Calgary ever getting back to the boom it was previously, but do you think we're eventually going to see a change in pipelines getting allowed and stuff like that?
Well, infrastructure that's a hard thing to speak about, because you just don't know based on who's going to be in power. Mm-hmm. I would say, though, there's a couple of aspects of that make me really positive, though. And I think as humans, we tend to sometimes look too negatively on things. I think we have so many people that are coming up in the industry. They're all young. They're all millennials. They all get conservation. They all get the idea of environmental accountability, First Nations involvement, all of these amazing things. A lot of them are women coming through. Like, it's just totally changed. And what is really empowering about that is that this industry, we will also push it in a new direction. Will it ever be like it was 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago? No. Everyone knows that. That is just a consensus across the board. However, I also think that we're going to continue to see these global demands of growth for energy. So because the world is going to increase in population, it is a done deal that they're going to need energy. And that's not going to go away. And because of that, we will maybe see depending on our leadership, we may see a couple of more years of really bad hardship and maybe even 5 years of bad hardship. But eventually, it takes one scandal in one country, like say you're importing most of your oil from Iraq and a dictatorship comes in, or this massive human rights issue breaks over and it just becomes a new sensation in the media. That is a high-risk environment for your assets. That's massively risky to invest in that country. Canada is not risky, but it is. And that's what's the irony about this whole aspect of risk. It's like, well, we shouldn't be this high risk. We should be where everyone wants to make a deal with us because of all the things we just talked about. And that's up to the leadership of Canada to really own us in on these kind of concepts and start putting that education out to every single person here that we should be proud of that. And unfortunately, we don't see that. And that's really, I think, where most of my anger gets placed, is in that kind of the federal leadership level. It's not on people that are out being activists, because it's an incredibly hard thing to do. They're passionate about what they believe in. I have a respect for that. But I really don't respect is when we don't have, on a federal level, you're running our country, or you're the prime minister of our country, and you can't even be bothered to come out west during your election campaign. I think that's just a shame. I think it speaks to the divisiveness of Canada, and I think that is that's just not a leadership that I'll ever support, because you really have to be connected to every province and every community and every cause. It's just not one or the other, right?
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So let's go back to the filmmaking process here. What do you think was one or two of the things that surprised you the most about making a documentary that you didn't expect?
Oh my gosh, it's so much work. I'd say what surprised me the most would probably be the amount of work that goes into editing. I mean, I always thought it was going to be painful. I thought it would be long. I didn't find filming the B-roll or going out and droning, doing the interviews, maybe because it's more interactive, it's more up my alley, that part was really good. But certainly when it came down to grinding it out for 4 months and going over every single piece of clip, I mean, I've memorized all the interviews. Like when I was doing it, it was like the raw footage. I knew at 11 minutes and 40 seconds, he made an sound, or like a yeah, or a nod. And all those little parts of it just consumed my life. And I had these huge charts all over my house, and I just looked like a conspiracy theorist. It was just everywhere. So I think those little things really taught me a lot. But overall, I think when you're so passionate about a project, you kind of oversee a lot of that stuff, because I'd sit there and have a bottle of wine and just work for 8 hours, and I'd look up and be like, oh my gosh, I gotta go to bed.
How many times do you think you watched the film?
Oh, I don't even know. I have no idea. I would say, put together, I would say probably at least over 200 times. So that would be from the primary construction of it, messing around with B-roll, moving B-roll around, all that other stuff. I mean, I just almost every day I'd watch it probably 2 times a day, make my edits. And then I would go back with editor Arden, and we'd, kind of hash it out. And then I'd make up some more edits the next time and kind of just keep building on it. We just basically did it as layers, which really helped. So I think the worst process, though, the worst day I ever had, I think he might say this too. We were so cranky, is when I had to do my interview on camera. And I hated it. I was so angry. Just for those 3 minutes of edited clips of film where it's me talking, that was probably a 9-hour day.
Wow.
It was awful. It was not good on camera. So I was I'm going to leave that for everybody else next time.
Do you feel better being on camera now?
No.
Really? I hope you didn't notice the cameras in the room.
It's fine. It's more conversation, so I'm okay.
Yeah, it definitely makes it a lot easier. So how did you fund the project?
The funding was kind of built into different parts. So for the first part of the project, I was just from waitressing. So all of my tips, once I paid for my bills in a month, then all the extra money just went to paying for the guys, whatever I needed to go out for a day of filming. or, how much I could film. So how many tips like I actually made in that month. So if I made more, then I could film more. If I made less, then I had to film a little less that month. But there's other parts, like once I got down to the editing and I was like, okay, I do not have 12 grand. And if I do 12 grand, and like if I come up with 12 grand at waitressing it's going to take me like a year and a half. So I was like, okay, I have to buckle down, like start asking for some help. So I was actually serving these guys one night, and I just kind of pitched them the film, and I had already had the trailer done. And he's like, yeah, I'm interested. Let's go for coffee the next day. And then he ended up liking it so much, presented it to his board. And I thought he was just going to help me like get 8 other companies on board, because I asked for $8 grand. And they just wrote me that check, and they just said, here, go for it. Like, we're so excited about it. Like, thank you so much for doing this. So that really like pushed my editing fees, which was awesome. And then I paid for the end of it. Into the new year, I ended up finishing up like a couple extra grand for editing fees, but I had a couple of months there to kind of save up for that, which was good. But that really fast tracked the project to getting done on time. So I wanted it to be finished before, at that time it would have been the provincial election and the federal election. So,
if you don't mind me asking, what was your total budget for the film? Like, do you know what it cost?
Yeah, it was like $32,000.
Wow. Yeah. That's crazy. I remember like close to when we first met, I was telling you that I had a similar idea. I was like, yeah, I think maybe try and like raise $1 million to put together. And you were like, $1 million.
I know. I do remember that. That was so funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, even Vivian Krause's, like hers was like $160,000. And I was like, what? I was like, that's so crazy to me. I was like, I was just on peanut budget. Like there's a lot of B-roll, and was from my iPhone. So it's amazing what you could do in an iPhone, though. Like because I was like, I don't have a budget to fly Arden to Ottawa, and for us to run around Ottawa for 2 weeks, like I just can't do that. So we talked about it, and I was really trying to get him out there, and I just said I can't. Like I just can't. Like I don't have the money for it. So I was going home for my grandma's 80th birthday, and I flew into Niagara Falls, where my uncle lives, and took his car and just drove all the way through Hamilton, up through Ottawa. And that's where all the shots of the film that you see, Ottawa or Hamilton or steel manufacturing, that was all from my iPhone.
Wow.
So I just put it in 4K and just held it there. I had like probably, I'd say like at least 100 clips, 10 seconds each on 4K. Like my phone was maxed out on storage. I just kept putting it in my computer and just kept going through it. And eventually there's a lot of obviously crap video in between all that, but there's a lot of really good clips that I got, and it just worked. Because you're only looking at it for maybe 3 seconds, right? So you can't do that through a whole film, because it really jeopardizes the overall feel of a film, especially a documentary. You need to have your beauty shots.
Yeah.
You gotta have your drone shots, and you can't cop out on those. And your interviews have to be really nice, right? But,
yeah. Well, I think that's why like Netflix requires a minimum percentage of shows or movies shot in like 4K raw, right?
It's all in 4K. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. They're really different now, though, their standards, because they've got like their documentaries are pretty much like movies now. They're like next level good.
Yeah.
Like they're not just in 4K. Like you got top end cinematographers working on those things, and editors.
Yeah, I always like watching the ones about like narcos and drug traffickers and stuff.
Yeah,
it's always fascinating.
The murder mystery ones. Yeah.
Yeah, really... cartels and stuff. Yeah, so you managed to get enough money together to produce the film, and then at what point did you kind of start figuring out what distribution would look like?
Well, I think like I was really stressed about distribution. I had no idea what to expect. That was the big question mark in my head. The only thing that I kept doing that I only knew how to do was do it organically, because everyone will say, like, any marketing videos I watched on YouTube, they're just like, you gotta build your base. You gotta have a base. You gotta have a story. You gotta have all these things. I was like, well, we got the story. We got the what the content is. Now, how do you get it out to people to watch it? And I just word of mouth like crazy. Like the girls at Joey's, every single one of my friends were like advocates for the film. They're like, Heidi's gonna be dropping the film in June. Like, she's almost finished it. There was like regulars calling me. There had people like hand me their business cards or like, just let me know on email when you're ready to drop it. Like, we'll send it out to our network. And it worked out so well for that reason. And again, the timing is everything, right? Like, I was really lucky because when I dropped it, it was before all the other documentaries came out about oil and gas. Like, there was Vivian Krause. There's that other guy too. What's his name? Anyway, he did Global Warning. And it's a really good documentary as well. But that all came later. Had I waited and I had dropped it after their films, it wouldn't have done as well. And that's just a reality because they had much bigger platforms to work on, right? Mm-hmm. And because it was right after the provincial election, Kenny had just got, had just won. And and then all these regulars showed up for the premiere, and everybody, like all the Joey's girls came, and they used their networks. All the people that were there used their networks. Jason Kenney retweeted it, and Brett Wilson, Vivian Krause. So like those were like big hitters in the industry, and it just kind of took off from there, and people were starting to pay attention a little bit.
Yeah, the premiere was packed. You had a really good turnout.
It was really good. I know. I was so stressed. Oh my gosh.
I remember before that, Ben and I were talking about going to it, and I was like, Joey Waitress made a documentary. This is going to be a rough hour and a half. And then I'm sitting there and I was like, wow, this is like incredible. I was blown away by how well done it was.
That's so funny.
So good.
It sounds like my mom's comment when I brought it back east. We did some screenings back home when I was there for the summer. Oh my gosh, it was so funny. She cried and she's like, well, I didn't know you were making a movie. And I was like, Mom, I told you for like 2 years I'm making this documentary. And she goes, well, don't take this the wrong way, but I didn't think it was going to be good. Okay, great.
That's funny.
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah.
My grandma was like, I thought it was going to be good. Like, thanks, Grandma.
At least one of your family had faith, eh?
Yeah, no, I think they were all kind of shocked. Well, I understand why, because it was just so flighty. I'm like, Mom, we're going to make a documentary. Like, who does that? I was like, but I was just blessed to have like a lot of good people on the way, and that makes everything. Which like anyone that starts off anything from scratch, they all say the same thing. It's not you. You're just kind of like the tunnel of information that gets everything done. Like you push the project, you make things done. You goal-oriented things. You day to day you have to grind. But other than that, it's really everybody else that comes together for it, right? Mm-hmm. Which is really powerful concept.
After the premiere, did you start pushing it towards film festivals?
No, I haven't at all. Which is so interesting. I got more wrapped up in the advocacy of it, right? Because I was back east talking about resource development and trying to show it out there and getting people to watch it and like attending conferences, that kind of thing. And that really was where my passion was, and it still continues to be. I think it's designed to. I don't know. Maybe it's a personal thing. It's probably just a me thing, but I feel like a film festival is like a pat on my back or something, and I'm more into like patting Canada's back, like getting people to actually listen to the conversation. And I like that it's used more of a learning tool more than just being like a documentary or a movie or something like that. I don't know. That's just weird. I'm just weird.
So do you have any kind of like ideas on metrics or sources of metrics for how many people are seeing it or how much distribution it's getting?
It's pretty good. So like, again, for being so organic and just sending it via email and doing a premiere, I'm so proud of how much like people have sent it around. And in Calgary, it definitely got sent around quite a bit. Like they have like this massive email network, right? They just send content to each other. Did really well in Calgary. It did quite well up in like BC area, so that'd be like Fort St. John area. And it also did really well in like financial district in Toronto. So my sister actually works in Toronto, and she had seen it, and she had sent it out to some of her people that she knew. And my roommate at the time, her dad works in the financial district, and he said he got it from one of his like friends of friends. So it like got circulated at least to Toronto area. Got a little bit in Nova Scotia, a little bit in New Brunswick, and a little bit in Ontario, like outskirts area. But the predominant was definitely Alberta based, and I'd say like northern BC, Saskatchewan, the provincial resource developing areas. They were kind of more the pro supporters of it, but yeah.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah.
So what's next with it?
Well, it's kind of interesting because they, since I've started with the film, there's a couple, like I was speaking at a panelist in Halifax. That was a really cool experience. And when you're speaking in these like energy conferences, it's not pro oil and gas, it's just energy. And there's a lot of misconceptions about it. So that was a really cool, I got asked to speak on behalf of that. There's a couple other things too. It's like there's the risk management. So it's more in the insurance side of things. So I'm just working with them right now, and we're doing an oil and gas forum and putting together our own kind of conference. And that's going to be all based from people coming out from Toronto. And I'm just helping them put it together, and then I'm going to be a moderator with that. It's just those little things that are like, they kind of just, like people have just been asking me, they were like, oh, I watched it. I really think this would be really useful for our company. You know, can you come speak to us? That kind of thing. So it's just been kind of here and there. Like I haven't really pushed it a whole lot since, you know, after the summer. It just kind of, especially after the federal election, things kind of died down a little bit in terms of momentum. But I certainly was really busy up until that point, just, you know, getting as much connections, getting as much videos, people watching it. And the cool thing is that when you see it on YouTube, you have one view, but like that one view was in front of like 100 people in a company. So it's like kind of cool that way. You don't really know how to measure what your true viewership is, but yeah.
Have you managed to monetize it at all, or monetize the speaking?
No, that's just all based on, you know, just kind of my free time type things. It's kind of like anything. You're starting off with the branding and you're starting off on such a low level. Like, I mean, I went from waitressing and like quite literally serving your tables like French fries and burgers, and like just the opportunity to be able to speak. It helps with my public speaking skills. It exposes me to people I never would be exposed to. I meet people outside of the industry. It's just a really rewarding part of it that, I know it sounds kind of cheesy, but like the monetary part is kind of like my last thing that I'm thinking about. Like moving forward, obviously, it's always nice to make a little bit of money off of something, but that always shouldn't be your driving factor when you're trying to make a political issue heard. It should always be based on what the foundation of it is. And sure, if it does make you money or if it does make you a career path, awesome. But I don't really see it that way. But
so do you have any plans for future films?
Yeah, I do actually.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I really want to. I'm starting to draft a new one right now. So I don't want to spend more than a couple of months drafting, and then I'm going to start filming again.
What's it going to be about?
So it's going to be more on Canada as a whole, on resource development. So I'm going to be looking at other industries and branching out a little bit outside of oil and gas, but using oil and gas as kind of the poster child for what we see as being like the bad kid of the family. You know, like we're kind of like that money hungry, evil, fear mongering, resource development kind of people that don't care about the environment, right? Mm-hmm. And I really want to apply that, like you kind of touched on that with the agricultural issues. You know, we've got steel manufacturing, we've got all these potential industries that could do really well, and they could have this accountability for the environment with the proper leadership and the proper technology development. And that's really what my main focus is going to be about for the next one.
Awesome. Yeah. So what does that 2-month drafting process look like?
Just me basically sitting down with myself, writing a lot of things down. No, I actually really, one of my favorite parts about making the film was the drafting process. I love to research and I love to read books. So I usually spend a couple of weeks like reading books, going through information, reading articles, asking people a lot of questions, and just starting to I always make my draft list of like my superstars that I want to interview. Like, you know, if I can ever get to them, that will be the other question. But like I'll put them down on a piece of paper and just be like, okay, these are people I actually want to try to get to. Like, how do I get to them? Do I know someone that knows them? Or do I have to cold call, email them? Do I have to write them memos? Like I usually try to put together a very detailed email with attachments so that they're not confused about the theme of the documentary, or that, you know, I'm pushing an ulterior motive at the end of the day through the editing process. Mm-hmm. So make it very clear it is a bias, you know, like it's my opinion, this is where I think Canada should be heading, and this is really the direction of the film. So I think that helps a lot. I think when people, again, you're doing this kind of line of work, it does get a little bit harder when you're when you're filming both sides. You don't really know how that's going to get edited together. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah. So where can people go to watch Stranded Nation?
So it's on YouTube.
Okay. Awesome. I'll have to make sure I put the link in the information for this interview.
That'd be great.
Cool.
Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me on. This has been, like I said, it's always so much fun to branch out into different areas and, do a podcast for the first time. It's exciting.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our first sponsor is Syndication, which is a video production company that I started. We do video production and online marketing for businesses of all sizes, ranging from solopreneurs to Fortune 500 companies.
Our next sponsor is Flagship Business Brokers. Flagship Business Brokers provides entrepreneurs with support through the purchase, sale, or financing of a business. They have a proven track record of delivering fast, cost-efficient, and client-focused transactions.
Another sponsor of the Ambition Project is BusinessLink. BusinessLink is Alberta's entrepreneurial hub. They are a nonprofit organization that helps people navigate the steps towards starting their own businesses. Just because you're in business for yourself doesn't mean you're in business by yourself. BusinessLink's team of in-house startup experts are there to support you all along the way.